at 12:30 Eastern. We go over the biggest stories of the week, and very excited to have a new guest with us on this edition of the Roundup. We have Suzanne Gordon, writer and reporter, contributor to The Prospect, writes primarily about issues involving the Veterans Administration, the Veterans Health Administration. Suzanne, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, David.
Yeah, absolutely. So you did a couple things for us in the last week. There's now a lot of attention on what the Trump administration is specifically doing with respect to the Veterans Administration and more directly issues of veterans health. So I want to talk about the stories that you've put together on that for The Prospect and some of the other things that are out there and what you're hearing. So the first story you did involved more of this sort of general operational degradation of the agency, the desire to really a continuation of the privatization of veterans health that we've seen, for several administrations now. Going back, including Democrats. So could you tell us what is happening with regard to open positions at the agency and how that affects privatization?
Yeah, so as you pointed out, there has tragically been a bipartisan consensus about privatizing the VA, and the Democrats sort of do privatization light, and the Republicans do privatization heavy. And I wrote this years ago for The Prospect, that nobody wants to use the P word because veterans just have a flip out, when they think about the Department of Veterans Affairs or the Veterans Health or Benefits Administration's going away, even though they're happy to criticize it, interim. And so this privatization movement started in 2014 and under Obama, with this Choice Act that let people go out of the Veterans Health Administration under restricted conditions, to see private sector providers. And then it accelerated under Trump. And tragically, a lot of Democrats voted for this so-called Mission Act, which set up this private sector network of providers that has grown from small to enormous, like over 1.7 million providers. And then Biden didn't reverse it, although they had a chance to do it. And they really, as we've written in The Prospect, they had a chance to reverse it. They didn't. And now Trump's come in and he's really taken advantage of the ground that in many ways Biden administration fertilized, but he's just taken a hatchet, to the department and the health system. And their plan really, the VA is made up of three agencies, sub-agencies: the Health Administration, the Benefits Administration, the cemeteries. And basically, they want to curtail veterans' benefits. That was kind of the first story that we wrote about, Collins coming in. Doug Collins is the new secretary, who amazingly Bernie Sanders and, a whole bunch of Democrats voted for, like Richard Blumenthal, who has subsequently apologized for his vote. Yeah. Kudos to you. Where's Bernie's apology? And this guy is really dangerous.
Doug Collins, let's just mention he was a member of Congress. Right. He I believe sat on the Veterans
no, he
Committee.
Didn't.
He actually didn't sit on the Veterans Committee.
He didn't sit on the Veterans Committee.
But he was a hard right congressman from Georgia. Served a few terms and now is in this huge position.
Yes, and he was defended Trump during the impeachment trial, and he was a military chaplain. I don't think of the sweet, touchy-feely variety, and in the Air Force, and which is notorious for its kind of evangelical right-wing stuff. And Collins, appeared very reasonable, compared to like Hegseth or Robert Kennedy or, some of these other folks. But interestingly, while Hegseth and Gabbard and so forth, that Musk um, issued this, mandate that everybody in the government has to write down, 5 things they did this week, like bringing to mommy and daddy at dinner, and Gabbard and Hegseth has said, no, we're not doing that. And Collins is making people do that in the VA, which is, could violate HIPAA and the health privacy law and so forth. So he's really bad news, and he's a true believer and, is going to salute the commander and do what he wants.
Yeah.
He has taken a huge axe in innumerable ways already in the past few weeks to the VA workforce, and we can talk about the various axes that he's wielded.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one area where I think you advanced the story, there were the cuts to probationary employees, VA. I think there were stages. Once they did 1,400, and then they cut another 1,000. But you have focused in a subsequent story for us on the cuts that specifically targeted research at the VA. When we
Right.
talk about federal research, a lot of times we're only talking about the National Institutes of Health. But as your story explains, the research functions of the federal government go well beyond that, and that VA research in particular has historically been extremely successful in bringing forward advances and innovations in health.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting, David, because it turns out, and I learned this, I didn't even know this until I started writing the story. I mean, I've always known about VA research, but it turns out that NIH and DoD tend to fund research that's done by other people. And
Mm-hmm.
VA both funds and conducts research. So it's actually, I mean, so in a funny way, I always have described VA as the second biggest research powerhouse in the country after NIH, but it's not clear that it may even be more of a research powerhouse because it actually conducts the research. And,
Right.
this may seem really in the weeds, but I think it's fascinating because like the tragedy about VA is that nobody really knows what it does, I
Right.
mean, and I was exhibit number 1 before 15 years ago or whenever I started writing about VA. I just sort of stumbled into it,
Mm-hmm.
because I wanted to know, like, I read about health systems, wanted to know, oh, what could you do if you had a real national health system? And then it was like, wow, I had no idea.
We do.
Yeah, we
we have
do.
one. It's called the VA. No, but I want to get back to research quickly because one of the things you put in the story is that the VA research function has led to the development of
Right,
artificial limbs,
right.
the first nicotine patch, the invention of the pacemaker, the first successful liver transplant, the development of the CT scan,
Right. It's
and
like
several new drugs
barcoding.
all came from VA.
Right. And the amazing thing about VA research is do not think it's just for veterans. I mean, when they developed the first implantable cardiac pacemaker, they didn't say, oh, sorry, David, you can't have that. You're not
Right,
a veteran, And
right,
when they developed barcoding of scanning drugs in hospitals, they didn't say, sorry, these patients, they are civilians, they go for it, kill them if you want, but our veterans. And so, I mean, the shingles vaccine, the first shingles vaccine was
hmm
it's just extraordinary. And the other thing that they do is they do studies that nobody will do because most studies that are done, often financed by drug companies or whatever, are studies where it's profitable. So they'll do a
right,
study looking at a cheap drug to treat diabetes, and seeing if it's better and it helps people avoid donor, organ transplant or kidney transplant or dialysis. It's a drug that exists, so nobody will ever make any money on it.
right.
They look at side effects. They do studies of side effects of meds that most
Hmm.
of the companies don't want to do because they don't want you to know about it. And B, they don't, there's no place that has a kind of discharge to grave population where you can see whether they were prescribed the drug, whether they refilled the drug, whether they took the drug, and what the side effects are. So there's all this research that they do that helps us, and nobody knows that they do it.
Yeah. Very,
Now,
very high quality, very,
right.
relatively low cost compared to the NIH. And what you're saying in this story is that the Trump administration has begun firing researchers and disabling a lot of this research. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So essentially, and it's fascinating to me because what's happening is, people aren't supposed to be talking to the press, quote unquote, and people are like inundating me with like help, write about
I'm
this.
I'm getting the same stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, you and which is great, right?
Hmm.
But um basically there's a whole bunch of different things they've done. So the first thing that they did was, well, first of all, in when they fired a lot of probationary people, some of those are researchers, some of those are people who work in institutional review boards, helping in IRB, what we call IRB, where you're helping folks apply and fulfill the very many regulations that go around research. Some of these probationary people are researchers or data collectors or whatever. So they fired a lot of those a number of those probationary people
Hmm.
work in research. Then and sounds a little weedy, but there's most scientific researchers are not on a permanent position. They're on these soft money contracts, so they depend
Hmm.
on grants, and their contracts are called NTEs, not to exceed. So they're these renewable contracts, many of them usually 3 years, and they roll over, right? And then they get renewed. And that's just, a vulnerability in the system, which probably should be remedied. There's a lot of vulnerabilities which should be remedied, which they've taken advantage of. And so essentially what they've done is they've just told these researchers on these contracts that we're sorry, bye, your contract's up, we're not renewing it. And these are people who are very prominent researchers who may have worked with the VA and the VA for, decades. And they're
Yeah.
basically, now their research studies are kind of fatherless, motherless, guideless, directionless, et cetera. They've also completely put a hold on a program where researchers, so let's say you're at Boston University or Duke University, and you're
Hmm.
paid for by Duke, but those are affiliates with the VA. And a researcher volunteers to do a study, help us with a study, collaborate on a study with VA, an ongoing study, but they're not paid for by VA. Paid for, they're without compensation. They're paid for by Duke or BU or whatever the affiliates. They put a hold on that. Now that, what is the cost saving there? Zero,
Yeah,
right?
it's crazy. So, I mean, it sounds like some of the things we're seeing across the federal government,
Right.
where wherever it's easier to cut these resources, to fire these workers, that's where they do it. The probationary employees don't have the same kind of federal civil service protections. So they're easier to fire, so they can go ahead and do it. With the without compensation, I'm sure that there was a reason that was just easier to do. But it's completely counterproductive, as you say, because there's no money being saved here when you're doing that. Of course, I have a story that just went up on the website that I'm going to talk about after you go about the CFPB. And they're trying to destroy that agency. And that's not going to save any money in the federal budget because that money comes from the Federal Reserve. It doesn't come out of federal expenditures. So, I don't think efficiency or budgetary savings is really the reason here why these individuals are being fired. It almost seems like an end in itself in many ways. And in the case of this VA funding, my understanding is a lot of it, the research funding, is to make sure that they're complying with these sort of anti-DEI,
Right.
anti-woke kind of strategies. And you write about how, that what that really is doing is punishing the ability to target therapies, to target treatment, to make sure that we're being effective in delivering treatment to certain populations.
Yeah, I mean, I want to return to what you said in a minute, but I'll
Uh-huh.
deal with this question. I mean, I think the problem is that in the minds of Trump, et cetera, well, I'm not sure he has much of a mind, but whatever about these things. But I think in the mind of a lot of people who kind of voted for him, diversity meant like, trans people or I don't know,
Right.
Black people or this people or that people. But in healthcare research, diversity means that like you and I are different, right? And
Right.
different populations are different. Like, Irish Americans are subject to different diseases and experience different conditions differently than Italian Americans or Scott.
And it's genetic, and it's because of environment, and
Right.
it's just a variety of different factors. This
Right.
is,
So,
yeah.
as I cited in the article, very deliberately, because I wanted a case of white people, not,
Right.
I mean, to do healthcare research effectively, so, we have this concept of like population health and how, not only a population, like an entire population experiences things, that's a public health concept, right? But how, within an entire population, there's subpopulations experience things. And so, for example, if you excise any discussion of differences, right, then you
Mm-hmm.
can't look at why is it that rural white people, a big MAGA group,
Right.
have less access to, stroke treatment after a stroke, or have less access to organ transplant, or
Right.
have this issue or that issue. You can't do that kind of research on
Right.
white people. And so you're punishing, you're basically just punishing everybody. You're not just punishing Black people
Yeah.
or women or whoever it is that you don't like at the moment. You're just
and
taking.
and and as you say in the article, some of this is affecting the ongoing treatment of veterans right now.
Yeah, no,
Right? I
this
mean,
is,
like specific things that are happening to veterans right now. But in other instances, it is affecting, everybody who would benefit from the scope of this research.
well, yeah, I mean, again, that's the problem often is that, before I started writing about the VA and the Veterans Health Administration, I mean, I would drive by these VA hospitals and think, or I would read something in the newspaper when, when there was an innovation or something, and I would say veterans, and I'd think, why should I read that? Even though I was in healthcare, it's for veterans, it's not for me. And the reality is this research, as we said at the beginning, is for you. And, but what's happening, and this is happening with all of research, but particularly, in the VA, it's been super impactful, is there, I mean, and it's like hard to overestimate the significance of this. These are,
Yeah.
there's about 370 clinical, studies and trials that have been funded by outside agencies. So it isn't even VA funding that are being interrupted. So that means that a veteran in the midst of a, trial treatment, they're getting treatment for something, right?
Right.
Is being told that, sorry, you can't get this treatment anymore. And I mean, that's unprecedented. It's, it would be, I
It's
mean,
horribly cruel. I
well, it's
mean.
cruel, unprecedented. I think I mean, I want to talk to some, if you know a good medical malpractice lawyer, I want to talk to them because
Yeah.
I want to find out if I think this constitutes, it's not clinical because the clinicians are being forced to
Right.
actually violate standard of care and violate ethics and commit malpractice because, Doug Collins and Trump and must say they should. And so, and you can't, the other thing about stuff for veterans is, I mean, there's a lot of research that is specific around veterans conditions that, by the way, helps a lot of people. Like, for example, Anne McGee, who's the big researcher who looked at, discovered the connection between
Hmm.
concussions and chronic traumatic encephalopathy in football players. She did
Mm.
that. She's a VA researcher. She
Right.
did that research on the brains of veterans. You can only diagnose this, on autopsy.
Right.
And they have one of the world's biggest banks of brain tissue. Well, what's going
Hmm.
to happen to that? And they have something called the Million Veterans Programs, where they're studying the connection between genetics and various conditions. It's the largest genetic repository in the world. What's going to
Yeah,
happen? That belongs to us. Must they
absolutely.
take it and monetize? I mean, the whole thing is, but I
Uh,
think veterans. So what I was going to say before I
mhm.
interrupted myself was that
Yeah.
was that um, many of these clinical trials, like looking at traumatic brain injury, which will, by the way, impact people who have traumatic brain injury who aren't veterans, but PTSD, a military sexual trauma, toxic exposures. Nobody in the private sector is going to pick up this research, right?
Right.
Um, and I mean, it also is just, you and I talked about this one time on the phone, is that the whole thing is sort of baffling to me. I mean, I understand a lot of what they're doing. I understand their logic about the privatization of veteran care and sending people to private doctors and stuff like that. Okay, it makes money, it's in their ideology, but nobody's going to pick up this research. And the private
Yeah.
sector benefits and makes profits out of what the
But
government does.
one thing that I was thinking about is, and it's a part of your story where you say this is going to disincentivize clinicians
Oh,
who
yeah.
want to do research on the
Right.
side to join up with the VA, because if the research funding is indeterminate, if it's not always going to be available and it's reliable, they're going to go elsewhere
Right.
for where they set up their practices, and that seems like a way in which this could further privatization. Because if you're getting less
Right.
talent in the workforce, first of all, there are going to be shortages for VA clinicians. And second of all, there are going to be better doctors on the outside. And, that will further the belief that, oh, we can just outsource this stuff from the VA into the private sector, and they can take care of it. Now, you've written a lot about why that whole idea is kind of bogus. That the idea that you can effectively outsource the kinds of clinical studies, the kinds of treatment that is needed of veterans to the private sector. Could you explain, why it doesn't make sense to outsource these functions?
Yeah, well, there's this idea, I think, in the public mind, and sometimes even doctors and clinicians, and that, patients, patients, patients. So and Collins said this in his hearing, Doug Collins, the new VA secretary. He said, the VA isn't unique. It's good, it's nice to have, but it's not unique. After all, they treat cancer outside the VA, they treat cancer inside the VA, and that is just, a very common idea that is truly stupid because, the VA is a very special population. They have different conditions. I mean, I had a friend who was a Vietnam vet, who had PTSD, went to the VA, got treated, then went out into the world, had his career, and then retired. And this is a very common scenario, and they work hard, they have a life, and then they retire, and many people get depressed when they retire, but people with PTSD from Vietnam really get depressed, and it kind of triggers them. And he went to this primary care provider who didn't know he was a Vietnam vet, amazingly, and he complained of insomnia and nightmares, and the guy was prescribed Ambien, which is contraindicated for PTSD. And the guy and the provider didn't, the doctor didn't think Vietnam vet, nightmares, insomnia. I have no medical training. I could have diagnosed it. And he ended up going back to the VA. But you have to know what is the difference between a cough and bronchiolitis from burn pits, or there's so many different conditions. And the other thing that is going to be missing, and these vets don't get this, is when you go to the VA and you are diagnosed with prostate cancer, or ALS or something due to Agent Orange, you are told by the VA to sign up for compensation, and you can get a lot of money, as you well deserve, from that condition. Right. These private sector doctors are not going to put you on a registry, so we're going to lose information about these conditions, and they are definitely not going to say, David, sign up. You can get $3,000 a month for the rest of your life.
Because they have no obligation to do that.
And they don't even know. They don't even know.
Or they don't even know about it. Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know how old you are, but I'm 79. I could have been a nurse in Vietnam. And, I have gone to the doctor a lot in my life. Nobody has ever asked me if I served in the military. It is not a standard question. So the biller in your office might know that you're a vet because you have a voucher, or because you were, sent through the Mission Act or something. But your doctor isn't necessarily going to know, because that is not on the form of your medical history when you write it down, and that's all they look at, even if they even look at it. And I mean, I've never known a doctor to go over the form that they fill out. So, I mean, they're going to get crappy care, and they're going to have longer waits, and it's not going to be conveniently located if they live in rural areas, because, guess what? There's no care in rural areas,
And I think what you're hitting on is one of the reasons why privatization is so desired by the conservative right. And we can talk about how Democrats have collaborated in this, but the idea to me is that they don't want a model of well-functioning national healthcare system just available out there that people know about and can see and can realize that this is something that we can all have. It doesn't need to just be for veterans. So I think that motivates everything in terms of the political right. But, you talked earlier about how certain senators agreed to vote for Doug Collins. You talked about how historically, under the Biden administration, even under the Obama administration, there were these efforts at privatization. To what do you attribute sort of the Democratic collaboration in this outsourcing? Is it purely because of funding? Is it because of some other ideological reason? What do you attribute it?
Well, first of all, most Democrats do not know, and their aides, which is even more important, the people who advise them, don't know much about what the VA does. Right. I mean, and even people on the committees. I mean, I have listened. I mean, it's enough, as you've listened to these hearings, it's enough. I mean, you have to take an extra dose of blood pressure medicine or something like that, I mean, it's torture, right. And I have listened to people like Julia Brownley, Democrat from California, say things like, oh, do they have good mental health care in the VA? I guess maybe they do. They really? Oh, maybe they do. It's like I heard Blumenthal one time, who, I mean, I'm now a big fan of his, but momentarily, but he once said in a Senate hearing, he once said, do they have tobacco cessation programs in the VA? And I'm like, wait
Hmm.
a minute,
Yeah.
like the nicotine patch, did you not hear about that? And so there, a
Right.
lot of times, these are people who are essentially running the biggest healthcare system in the country on these committees who know nothing about healthcare.
Right.
And
Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah, and I think there's this, you always have in Democratic circles from at least some people this overarching desire to be bipartisan
oh yeah,
and to
well,
come up with bipartisan solutions. And what's amazing is that when you go back to sort of one of the initial ways in which VA care was really transformed, it was, the Bernie Sanders, John McCain bill.
yeah,
That wasn't the Mission Act, but that was prior
the
to that.
Choice
And
Act.
the Choice Act, and there were some privatization aspects in that. And this is Bernie Sanders that we're talking about.
Well, that's really, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because the history of this is really interesting. In February of 2014, Bernie introduced one of the best bills that needs to be reintroduced again in a different form. And I'm not an
Okay.
expert in this. I mean, um, and um, and he worked with the VA and the veteran service organizations, and we should talk about them in a minute,
Mm-hmm.
because they deserve a lot of, they have a lot to answer for. But he worked with VSOs and the VA on a bill that asked for $21 billion for the VA, and it was going to hire more staff and put together more programs. It was a very good bill, fabulous bill. Everybody liked it. And McCain torpedoed it. And so that never even came up for a vote. So keep this in the math in mind. So the VA, it is agreed upon, and this is just for healthcare, not for infrastructure, because that's a whole other can of worms, right? Which we've
Mm-hmm.
written about a lot at the prospect.
Yeah.
And 21 billion, they needed 21 billion. McCain torpedoes it. And so Bernie, I think he regrets this, but I don't know. He's never said that to me. But Bernie is desperate to get money for staffing. And so he signs on with McCain to this choice program, which is supposed to sunset in 3 years and is the opening door to privatization, where vets who live, I believe, it have to wait 30 days for an appointment or drive 40 miles for an appointment, can go to a private sector provider. But it's supposed to be temporary. And they fund the Choice Act with 16 billion, and he gets 6 for staffing. So recall the VA needs 21 billion and it gets 6.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And then McCain turns around and says, oh, gee, I crossed my fingers behind my back, and
Hmm.
this isn't going to be, I want this now to be permanent. And so essentially McCain screws Bernie, and this sets the stage. And then Trump
Mm.
comes in, and the problem is that a lot of these veterans kind of like, it's interesting. Like, if you ask them if they like choice, they love it. If you ask them if they want to privatize the VA, they'll attack you, right? And so, I mean, people
There's a
are
disconnect there. Yeah.
right. They
They
don't
want the
get.
option, but they realize that they're getting really good care at the VA.
Yeah, and 92% of them say they don't want the VA. They want it to be improved, not dismantled. And now they're having flip outs because of this data breaches, and they're gonna, I mean, and so the thing is that the Democrats, I think, many of them, as you've written, I mean, the prospect, are essentially share a sort of neoliberal view of privatization. They
Right.
and we wrote about this, and I think this is a really important article. And I thank Paul Starr for his, I think it was 1968 or 78 article on privatization. You
Yeah.
know, And I always advise people, and if any of your listeners are ever going to write to Congress or meet with a congressperson, I advise people never to use the word privatization. Do not go to a congressperson. Don't go to Jerry Moran or Doug Collins or Tom Tillis or one
Mhm.
of these people and say, we want you not to privatize the VA, because they'll go, oh my goodness, we would never do that, and
Mhm.
but what you have to use is, what you have to say is, stop outsourcing, stop defunding, stop
Right.
firing.
Right.
I always tell people to watch that great movie that Dudley Moore and Peter Cook did. And I can't remember when it was, Bedazzled. Do you remember that
Oh
movie?
yeah, when he was the Peter Cook was the devil, and Dudley Moore kept asking for things,
Right. He
and but
got,
he wasn't specific enough with his
yeah,
language, so
right.
he'd always get screwed. Yeah.
He always, so if you're not specific enough, if you don't say
Right.
outsourcing staffing, they'll say,
Right.
oh, we're not for privatization, because they define privatization as, we're going to close the VA tomorrow. Whereas
Right.
what Paul Starr pointed out is, there's a spectrum, right, of the cut to 1,000 cuts versus closing it down. And so I think that,
Hmm.
um, and I think that there's also money. I mean, for these Dems, right? The hospital industry benefits, the pharmaceutical industry,
Sure, if you're outsourcing, yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about a little bit about the future and what you're working on, currently, because one of the big issues that came out this week was this mass reduction in contracts at the
yeah,
VA, which was all done under a particular code. But when you stepped into what that code meant in terms of canceling those contracts, it was things like chemotherapy treatments for veterans and a whole host of other ranges of treatment. And they're trying to sort of frantically reverse the process of canceling these contracts. So I want to know what you've heard about that, and also anything else that you're hearing about, the ongoing situation at the agency.
well, I mean, one of the things that I'm glad you raised is that the contract that they canceled was for a data platform called Qualtrics. And that's where they keep data. All the researchers in the VA keep data, and they canceled the contract. They never went to the researchers and said, back up your data. And so people were just like freaking out, because all this data that they've amassed it could be disappeared. I have been so busy following the research thing, David, that I haven't followed so much the contract thing. But
Mm-hmm.
but the point is that they don't care if they're interrupting your clinical trial. They don't care what, I mean, they don't give a shit about people, about veterans. And they're literally killing people, and they're killing veterans. And so I think that yes, we have to follow the contract story. I think we have to follow the VSO story. What are the VSO, the Veteran Service Organizations, doing
Yeah.
of this? The
And across the board, really, too, because it's not just where veterans are getting their health care. One of the things that has come out amid these mass firings across the federal government is that about 30% of
oh yeah,
all federal employees are veterans.
yeah,
A number of those are in, the Department of Defense. I think that number is
yeah,
over 40%. But even in agencies where you wouldn't think there are large concentrations of veterans, there are, and not just veterans, but military spouses. I've
yeah,
heard many stories of military spouses who work for the federal government because their spouse is posted, in or near Washington, or in an area where they have federal jobs. They make great employees, and because they're either probationary, because veterans move around a lot, and so these military spouses take new jobs, and within the first 2 years they can be fired. So I'm hearing a lot of stories about military spouses being fired too. And so for me, the veterans, and describe what you mean by veteran service organizations, but it does seem like they have a huge role to play here, not just in the problems with research and the problems with the VA health system, but also just employment generally for veterans.
well, I mean, the veteran service organizations are these chartered organizations that provide services to veterans. And, you know, there's the legacy ones, the traditional ones, the American Legion, the VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars, AMVETS, Paralyzed Veterans America, Disabled American Veterans. Tragically, they really contributed to the privatization of the VA when they supported the Mission Act. And now some of them are really speaking out about the destruction of the VA. The VFW issued a very scathing statement about the firings. PVA, Carl Blake, gave us a great quote, which, I mean, it was completely scathing.
PVA is Paralyzed
Veterans of America. And tragically, the Vietnam Veterans of America, which was one of the best, because it's kind of a dying organization because its members are dying, because, like, you know, I mean, and then but I've been very disappointed with DAV because they issued a very tepid statement about the firings. I mean, Christopher Goldsmith wrote a fabulous article about this on Substack that people should read. But I mean, they basically said, oh, you know, we're really sorry about this. They weren't done transparently enough, as if, you know, if it were done with more transparency, it would be okay. And I mean, I think one of the one caveat I have about some of this is that, you know, you don't want to just protest the firings of veterans in the federal government. I mean, this is time for, you know, veterans to step up and say, we, you know, fought for this, the integrity of the Constitution in this nation, and we don't think this should be happening to anybody. Nobody should lose their health care. Nobody should lose their job. I mean, Blake at PVA was fabulous on Trump's attack on disabled folks, you know, when he blamed the crash in DC on you know, DEI and all that crap. But I mean, what I really want veterans to become, and you wrote such a heartening article about this, David, about, you know, this is not a done deal. I mean, people are assailing their Republican Congress people. And I want, you know, I want veterans to become Kansas farmers, you know, because like Jerry Moran is the chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and, you know, he went back to Kansas, and all the Kansas farmers who voted for Trump, suddenly the light bulb went on and said, oh, USAID, that $2 billion isn't going to farmers in Uganda, it's going to us, and you're screwing us out of $2 billion. And they attacked Moran, and we have to really, as you said, get these people. I mean, I think that, I don't know if you and I disagree, but, you know, I mean, people don't vote on abstractions. They don't vote to save democracy. They don't vote, you know, they're not going to change our healthcare system for healthcare as a human right. They vote on, you know, bread and butter. Class.
What's in it for me? Yeah, absolutely.
Or us, the tribe, whatever.
Yeah.
And we have to show people, you know, it's kind of like the Germans after World War II. There's a great book called The Aftermath, where it looked at the German population, how they reconstructed themselves as victims of Hitler in order and we have to make these people victims of Trump, and particularly Musk, you know.
Yeah. Well, I know you have another appointment, so a dentist appointment, but, you know, we are really blessed to have you, Suzanne Gordon, and Steve Early working on these critical issues around veterans and the Veterans Health Administration. So we look forward to having much more from you at the Prospect. And thank you for being here today.
Yeah, and I just want to give a shout out to the Prospect, because you are practically the only ones that pay attention to these issues, and it's like,
well, it's super important, and we will continue to do so. So thanks a lot,
Take care,
Suzanne.
David. Bye.
All right, see you later. Bye. Okay, we have about 15 minutes. I'm going to have to go solo for these final 15, but I'm happy to take your questions. The one thing I want to talk about is something that we just put up on the website right before we got started here. And that is about a really remarkable series of declarations that were committed in a case called National Treasury Employees Union versus Vought. And this is involved. This is about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and there is currently a temporary restraining order in place stopping Vought from firing additional employees. Vought currently is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, but he's also the acting director of CFPB. And the order in place stops him from canceling funds and from firing workers and from disseminating or getting rid, I should say, of agency records or things like that. And there's a hearing coming up next week. And so a lot of declarations were filed this week about this situation at CFPB. And they outline a process by which the senior executives at CFPB, led by Vought, were going to destroy the agency. So if you just read the declarations, they outline the process that on February 13th, the first step was taken where probationary employees and so-called term employees that have a fixed term of employment were fired. And then the next day, there was going to be this Valentine's Day massacre of 1,200 employees were going to be fired. Entire offices, entire divisions, entire units were going to be let go. And then within 60 to 90 days, everybody else at the agency would be fired, leaving it down to only the 5 individuals who are statutory, who are named positions in the Dodd-Frank Act. Those would be the only ones left. And one senior executive, according to the declaration, said the CFPB would become a room at Treasury, White House, or Federal Reserve with 5 men and a phone. And it did say men, by the way. So this was a blueprint to illegally destroy an agency that has statutory responsibilities, that has things that are laid down in statute that they are required to do. Even after the restraining order was put in place, which blocked the second step of this, which was the elimination of 1,200 jobs and the elimination of a bunch of divisions, senior executives were saying things like the writing was on the wall, it was all over but the terminations. There was blocking. Everybody at the CFP is under a stop work order right now. Employees who send messages to the Human Resources Department get an auto response that refers to their recent or impending separation, regardless of who they are and what they do at the agency. And basically, this would be a zombie organization that would exist in name only. That is what it's at stake in this lawsuit. The lawsuit is ongoing. There's going to be a hearing next week, and preparations are being made if the government wins this lawsuit to destroy the agency, to do all of the things that I discussed. The other thing that is in the declarations is basically a rebuttal to Adam Martinez, who is the chief operations officer of the CFPB. He gave a declaration earlier in the week that said this is normal, this is common during transitions of power, and that we are going to see the normal course of pauses while the agency gets up and running. And Martinez claimed that functions were being carried out, statutory functions, things like the Consumer Complaint Database, the Office of the Student Loan Ombudsman, were being done. And basically, the declarations accuse Martinez of lying. So on the Consumer Complaint Database, they did restore the contract to keep the hotline going. There's a phone number that is operational. However, the database itself that logs these consumer complaints is not working currently. So, any complaints about companies that aren't already in the database, those have to be manually added, and they're not being added. Any complaints that were referred by congressional offices or states or federal agencies are not being added or reviewed because there's nobody available to do that. Any complaints with even misspelled names of companies who are in the database are not being added because they have no ability to do so. There are tens of thousands of complaints that have been filed by individuals who had problems, felt like they were being screwed in a financial transaction, that are being held basically in limbo and awaiting review, and nobody is doing those reviews. And the complaints also aren't being monitored after being automatically sent to companies. Nobody's investigating whether the companies are responding, and the systems aren't being maintained. Even the contract for the virus scanning software in the consumer complaint database was not renewed. And it was canceled. So basically, the consumer complaint database, which is statutory, it says in Dodd-Frank that CFPB shall maintain a consumer complaint database. It is not being maintained. Another example is the Office of the Student Loan Ombudsman, which is an office that students with loans can go to if they're having issues with their servicer or anything around their student loans. What Martinez said is that, individuals can go to the regular CFPB ombudsman office if they have issues with their student loans. But the ombudsman office is different than the student loan ombudsman. The ombudsman office is for people who have complaints about the CFPB, not for people who have complaints about student lending companies or other, covered entities, regulated entities from the CFPB. So that was just a flat out lie, either a misunderstanding of what the ombudsman office is, or a deliberate attempt to mislead the court. So there are a number of these other things that the declarations take issue with. It's really an incredible set of declarations that were put in this case today that they suggest that the filings from the government in the case were either deceptive or flat out lies. And it's really a remarkable thing. Now we have a question here, Kelly Willis. I know Kelly. Here's the question. If Sauer, I don't know who Sauer is, it feels the president can ignore court rulings, what's the need for a solicitor general at all if adverse outcomes of any argument can be ignored? I mean, there are certainly ways in which the government is not fulfilling certain responsibilities that have been laid down by court order. The biggest one of these is in the U.S. Agency for International Development case, where a lower court judge demanded that work that was already performed be paid by the government prior to, I believe the deadline was within 48 hours or something. And that deadline was extended by John Roberts. So we're seeing the government sort of try to defy these court orders, but it's unclear whether or not that's going to hold. There's likely to be some sort of order in that USAID case to see if the government does have to pay out those existing invoices, and whether or not they're going to have to restart some of these other programs. So we're gonna find out about that real soon. The Supreme Court, other than Roberts sort of temporarily extending this stay, has not really decided or weighed in on any case. That's where the rubber will meet the road. That's where we'll figure out whether or not the Trump administration is willing to just defy these rulings. I have a couple other questions here. One from John Darner. Last week, Bob Kuttner seemed very concerned about stories, what the political effect of our stories are. He mentions that Robert Reich has amplified calls for a consumer boycott today. My personal view is that a one-day boycott isn't going to really do anything, and no buy Friday is going to be followed by a buy stuff Saturday. To the extent that these things continue and that you hurt companies specifically with your wallet, I think they need to be targeted. I think the programs against Tesla are having an intended effect precisely because the kind of people who would buy Teslas are more liberal in their orientation, and therefore Musk, by doing what he is doing, is alienating his own customer base at Tesla. I think there are possibilities there, but broad consumer boycotts it usually can't work if you're, if you're going to feed yourself at some point. It's going to be difficult to sustain. Jared writes, are there any more plans to publish articles on the abundance agenda? There are a couple books coming out about this whole concept of America needs to build, and various deregulatory functions need to be put in place so that that can happen. We are actually going to have a review of a couple of those books on the abundance agenda that are coming out. That's going to be in our next print issue, actually. I recently received the draft for that. So we are going to have a couple more articles on that. I do think it's an important issue that Democrats need to be debating. So that's about all I have. I urge you to check out the piece on the plot to destroy the CFPB. As you know, the prospect is, and I think we are making a difference, by the way. I don't know that that's what Bob was saying last week. We are dedicated to providing this information about what is happening in the federal government, what's at stake, and who, why it matters to you, who's benefiting. And that information is power, and it's tools that you can use in whatever it is the individuals or organizations decide to do to try to fight back. And we're seeing more and more of that happening every day. So I'm very happy and pleased and proud of our coverage. And we're going to continue to do it. We're going to continue to have these sessions where we talk about the issues of the day. We do the Roundup every Friday at 12:30 Eastern, 9:30 Pacific. And we will be back next week with one of these. We put these on the website, so over the weekend, if you missed it, you can take a look. And we will see you back here next Friday. So have a very good weekend, everyone.